right, well, as you make your way back to your seats, I'll go ahead and get rolling here. So my name is Mike Hannewald. I'm an agronomist with Beck's Hybrids. I cover the northern half of Ohio, and I've got 5 counties in northeast Indiana. And Grant invited me to come here today to share some agronomic information with you all. This is not going to be a Beck seed talk. We're not going to talk about hybrids and how to place or manage them. We're here to talk about the agronomics of planting and some of the research that Beck's has done over the years with that. So I graduated from Ohio State several years ago and back home on the family farm up by Waterville, Ohio, just west of Toledo. So when I'm not working for Beck's, I'm farming with my dad, so I get a chance to use a lot of this firsthand. And happy to be with you all here today to hopefully share some things. Some of the things have already been touched on a little bit, but maybe go into a little bit of the agronomics behind the equipment and why it's important to have the equipment set up the way that you've been learning about all morning. So in front of you, we have, borrow this real quick, Planter Resource Guide. If you want to take a look at that, majority of the information I'll be talking about today is in this book. I've got the page numbers referenced on my slides, so if you want to flip through and follow along and jot some notes down, you're welcome to take this home with you. Encourage you to take it home with you. There's a lot more information in here than what I'm going to talk about today. Everything we've ever tested related to planters is in here, so take a look at that. If there's not enough, I've got extras that we'll make sure you have one before you leave. So, all right. So to dive right in, so just a little bit of background on Beck's if you're not familiar with the company. The company was founded in 1937. Lawrence and Francis Beck, you see pictured on the screen, set aside one area of one of their barns to start processing and cleaning and growing seed corn. And so they started with 6 acres that year, 6 acres of hybrid seed corn, and it's has continued to grow from the very beginning, and now Beck's is the 3rd largest seed company in the country and the largest family-owned seed company in the country. And there's our home office there in Atlanta, Indiana. The original farmhouse still sits right there. So pretty neat, the heritage and the amount of growth and expansion that Beck's has had. Now, something that Beck's does that is very unique in the seed industry is we've got a program called Practical Farm Research. We just celebrated our 60th anniversary when Sonny Beck came home from Purdue University, came back to the farm in 1964. He set aside a few acres to do some agronomic trials that very first year that he was involved in the company, and that's grown now 60 years later. We've got 12 locations, over 1,000 acres that we do this agronomic testing. This isn't just evaluating, does hybrid A fertilizer system should you put on a planter, along with fungicides and nitrogen and everything you can imagine. So we got lots of information. So that's where all this data comes from. It's consistent replicated data, so all of our studies follow the rule of 3 to 5. 300 to 500 foot long plots, 3 to 5 replications at each location, and then we replicate each study at 3 to 5 locations. And all that gets put together in our PFR book, 250 pages this year, that if you are a Beck's customer, you've already received. If you're not a Beck's customer, you can talk to me and I'll get you one. Get one for you, and then a lot of other information online. So our closest location to here would be our London, Ohio PFR location, right next to Farm Science Review, if you're familiar with that. All right, you're gonna see on the slides this PFR proven concept. If you're not familiar with that, those are the products or practices that we've identified that have been the most consistent in all the things we've tested. So in order to earn that designation, a product has to be tested for at least 3 years at multiple locations. It has to gain yield every year, and over that 3-year period, it has to average a positive return on investment. And so it has to be profitable after you pay for the cost of the product. So anytime you see a dollar sign on the screen, that's return on investment. So that's the yield gained times the price of corn or beans, then we subtract out of that the cost of the product that we applied to get them most profitable. So those PFR proven, that's like the gold nuggets in PFR. All right, our agenda for today. We're going to cover planting date, planting depth, downforce. If we have time, we'll do row cleaners, and then we'll hit on starter fertilizer and get you wrapped up around 12:15 for lunch will be the goal. So, all right, planting date. When's the best time to plant? When it's dry. Good answer, good answer. When the conditions warrant, right? And those windows can sometimes be pretty narrow. So Starting off with corn, we got 15 years of data. I just pulled our Indiana PFR site data here because we have the most years at that location. But 15 years of data shows best time to plant corn is the second half of April. How about beans? About the same. Second half of April is when we're finding the best time to plant beans. So ideally, you want to plant corn and beans both at the same time if you can. If you've got the manpower and the equipment to be able to do so. But if you don't have the ability to plant both corn and beans at the same time, which one should you prioritize? Anyone have a guess or want to throw out an idea? Beans, okay. So the few volunteers who spoke up said beans. I would agree with that. Here's why. So this is another way of looking at the same data that I just showed you. This is corn planting dates, 15 years of data. And what it's showing is the number of times that each planting range was the best time to plant corn and the worst time to plant corn. So the green bars are the best. So we look at that second half of April, which ultimately produced the highest yield, but only 2 out of the 15 years was that the best time to plant corn. Interesting. It was never the worst time. But you look at those green bars and they're fairly evenly distributed across all the planting dates. Except for maybe June, but June was over half the time June was the worst time to plant corn, but there was that one year that June was the best time to plant corn. And I think most of us in the room can probably think of a year in our farming career when the June planted corn did the best that particular year. So why is it so spread out? It comes back to the gentleman who answered the first when I said, when's the best time to plant? He said, when it's dry. For corn, it's about the picket fence stand and the photocopied plants, that combination. And in order to get that, we need to be planting into as close to perfect conditions as what we possibly can and have a planter set up to put that seed in the ground correctly and get that picket fence stand of photocopied plants. The other thing that affects planting date in corn is pollination weather. Right? This doesn't affect planting date. The other main thing that affects yield in corn is our weather at pollination. And our planting date has a direct influence on that. Now, the day we go to plant corn and we're deciding whether or not to plant, can we think about, do I want to plant now or do I want to wait a week? When's going to be the better weather for pollination? We don't know that, right? We can't control that. But that's why that ideal date for corn fluctuates so much from year to year. But what we can control is the conditions the day that we plant. And so for corn, we really want to prioritize those windows when the conditions are right, when we have good dry soils to plant into without a big rain coming in the near future. So that's real important for corn. Beans, on the other hand, you see that graph shifts, and those green bars shift a lot earlier. April, 11 out of the 15 years, April was the best time to plant beans. It was never the best time to plant beans in June. Now, sometimes Mother Nature forces us to plant beans late because that's the first time it gets dry to get out there and do it. But with beans, there's a lot bigger reward to planting them early. Why is that? Well, think about a soybean plant. A soybean plant, its maturity is not based on calendar days or heat units like corn. Its maturity is based on the length of the day. And so when we get to June 21st, that flips a switch in that soybean plant from vegetative to reproductive. All right, corn, that switch is flipped when the tassel comes out, and it has to get so much heat before that tassel comes out, regardless of when you plant it. But beans, you get to that June 21st, and it's going to start the reproductive phases regardless of where it's at vegetatively. Well, your vegetative growth, that's growing stems and leaves. So the earlier you plant, the more time you give that bean plant before June 21st to grow vegetatively, to focus on growing stems and leaves and get that growth done and out of the way. So then when that switch flips on June 21st and it starts to grow flowers and pods and seed, which ultimately contribute to our yield, at that point, it's already got the factory built. It's got the structure of the plant already built. And so it can focus a higher percentage of its energy towards flowers, pods, and seed, and less of its energy towards stems and leaves. And what ultimately makes our yield are flowers, which lead to pods, which lead to seed. So That's why I think we see the bigger benefit to planting beans early than what we do corn. And so I would encourage you that when you're deciding what do I go plant first, if I can't plant both at the same time, our data would suggest it makes more sense to prioritize beans for the early planting and capture that more consistent benefit from the early planting, and focus on putting the corn in the ground when the conditions are as close to perfect as possible. Questions or comments? All right. Planting depth. How deep should you plant? About this deep, right? That second knuckle. How much focus do we put on planting depth? I know it's something very simple, but it has a big influence. For corn, that is 2 inches. Probably not a big surprise to anyone. But here's the interesting thing is, look at the yield penalties if you're wrong. Too shallow, 1.3 bushels. Too deep, 3.3 bushels. There's a lot of things that we might do on our farms to try and chase 1 to 3 bushels of yield gain, right? We might throw in a foliar feed or a sugar product or something when we go across the field and spray. We might add something else to our starter fertilizer program to try and gain 1 to 3 bushels. But what does planting depth cost us? About 5 minutes, right? To get out of the planter and check that and see where you're at. So that's a really important thing, a very simple thing, but don't overlook it. The simple things can really make a difference in your final yield and final ROI. So every field, take time at least once to get out and dig some seed, check it. You've got the seed diggers in front of you. You can take a look and see what you're like. While you're looking at it, look at your conditions. What's your furrow look like? Are you smearing the sidewalls? Is it too wet? I see you guys have seed diggers with a bottle opener on it, so if you dig around and it's too wet, take the planter back home and then use the other end of that seed digger and relax for the afternoon, right? All right, why is that 2-inch depth important with corn? It's finding the balance of temperature. So what this is showing is the average soil temperature from April 20th to May 30th, when the majority of our corn is planted. And so you can see average air temperature 59, 2 inches down 58, 4 inches down 57. So obviously the deeper you go, the colder that temperature gets, no surprise, right? So warmer temperatures, that corn's gonna emerge faster, right? That seedling's only gonna grow if it's above 50 degrees. So being closer to the surface is gonna be warmer. However, when you look at the 24-hour variation, even though we get cooler as we go deeper, what this is telling you is what's the change from the high to the low. So the air temperatures on average during this 6-week period, the air temperatures vary 23 degrees from the high to the low for the day. At 2 inches down, that's only 14 degrees, 4 inches is only 8 degrees variability. So the deeper you go, the more consistent your temperatures are. So even though that soil might be a little bit colder at the 2-inch depth, the consistency is more important there, again, to keep that plant slow, steady, growing, and getting up out of the ground, as opposed to if you're too shallow, really taking off and getting going too fast. But then at night, cooling down and reversing that process. So that 2-inch depth is where we found is ideal. The other thing is 2 inches is really important for setting your roots. So your seed is put there, you have your radical root emerges first, then all your seminal roots, and then your nodal roots or your crown roots start to form up higher. This seedling doesn't have those yet. But you need to be at least that 2 inches in order for those crown roots to set at the correct depth. If you go too shallow, the crown roots won't set correctly, and you can run into some standability challenges later on in the season. So when you're checking your depth, I always, sometimes it's really close. You're there, you're digging, you're measuring, and like, oh, I'm right on the fence. Should I leave it alone, or should I just set it deeper or shallower? My advice is err on the side of being too deep than too shallow. I see when I walk fields in the spring of challenges with emergence and stands, I see far more problems planting too shallow than what I ever do with planting too deep. So keep that in mind. All right, soybeans, 1.5 inches is our ideal planting depth. Might be a little bit deeper than what we might think of. I've heard several guys say, well, I always heard that if you don't see a few on top, you're planting too deep. Well, usually that was with a drill. And now that we've got planters with a lot better capability, want to run them a little bit deeper, that 1.5 inch depth. But look at what happens if you're wrong in beans. 2.5 bushels. That's a big deal in soybeans. Why is it so significant? Well, if you're too deep, the beans aren't going to get up in time before you get a hard pounding rain and you get concrete, right? That's too deep's a pretty obvious one. But what about too shallow? What's it hurting us if we plant those beans too shallow? Has to do with nodulation. So, anyone know what temperature nodules are most efficient at producing nitrogen in soybeans? Anyone shout out a guess? All right, it's about like what the temperatures that we like, 68 to 74. So about where you'd set your thermostat at your house, that's when those nodules are most efficient. Well, we know how important those nodules are. It takes 4 to 5 pounds of nitrogen to grow 1 bushel of beans. And we're not side dressing our beans, so we're counting on those nodules to produce all that nitrogen that soybean crop needs to grow our 60, 70, 80 bushel bean crop, right? Well, if we're demanding 300 to 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre out of those nodules, we need them operating as efficiently as possible. And when you think about a 95-degree sunny July day, how warm do you think that soil is in those top few inches? A lot warmer than 95 degrees. And so if we can keep those nodules cooler, a lot warmer than that 68 to 74 degrees. If we can keep those nodules cooler, they're going to be more efficient. Well, what does this have anything to do with planting depth? Interesting fact, when we did our planting depth studies, we dug a lot of those plants throughout the season, and we noticed that the majority of your nodules will form at the depth that you plant. Obviously, they'll spread out top to bottom quite a ways, but most of those nodules are going to be at the depth that you plant. And so you can influence the depth of those nodules with your planting depth. And so if you're planting at 3/4 of an inch to an inch, your nodules are going to be shallower, and they're going to be a lot hotter on those hot, sunny July days. If you can put them down a little bit deeper, they're going to stay cooler, and that's going to help maximize the efficiency. And so that's where we found that 1.5 inches is the balance between as deep as we can go to keep the nodules cooler, but yet still shallow enough to get the beans up out of the ground. All right, this was mentioned in the planter setup. The depth calibration, the example given was with a 2x4. You can also 2x4 and a piece of plywood. You can get right to your 2 inches if you want to set it. It was really interesting. I did not know that case planters can go down to 1/8 of an inch of adjustment. So that's really encouraging that you can get that fine of adjustment. Just make sure your planter's calibrated correctly. But the other thing I want to mention here when it comes to depth is when you are in the field and you're digging your seed and you find out, okay, I'm planting a quarter inch too shallow and I want to go deeper. Before you grab that handle and adjust your depth, I want you to ask yourself, do I need to change my depth or do I need to change my down pressure? And the reason for that is because your depth is controlled by the distance between the bottom of your gauge wheel and the bottom of your disc opener, right? Well, if you were just planting in one field and you were putting your corn down right at 2 inches, right where you want it to go, and now you move to another field and now you're running a quarter inch too shallow, did the distance from the bottom of your gauge wheel to the bottom of your opener change by a quarter inch? I don't think you wore your blades that fast, right? That distance didn't change. What changed are the conditions that you're planting into, and now this field that you're in now, your planter's having a harder time pushing those disc openers all the way down to 2 inches. So in that case, we need to increase our down pressure or adjust our settings. If you've got hydraulic downforce, it does a lot of that automatically for you, but just think about that. Anytime that you go to change your depth, before you move that handle, just ask, okay, why do I think I need to change my depth now? And is it really a depth issue or is it a down pressure issue? And make the appropriate adjustment. Speaking of downforce, go ahead and talk about that. So these are pages 7, 12, and 14 in your books if you're following along. All right, so we've tested delta force from Precision, which is what these planters have on them. We've been testing this for 3 years in our PFR testing. And so how we test this, because we don't have, it's hard to get multiple planters that plant the same, and we don't really want to be installing delta force and pulling it off and putting springs on. So what we did to compare the delta force to springs is we let the delta force run automated, And then we set the delta force at a manual setting that's supposed to correspond with a spring setting, with where you would set that spring. And so we look at the delta force compared to those 3 different manual settings at those different applied down pressures, 50 pounds, 125, and 250. And you can see that even when we had it set at what would have been the ideal manual setting, we were still gaining almost 2 bushels there with the delta force. Now the other thing you got to keep in mind is we're doing these, we've got 300 to 500 foot long plots at our locations where we're doing this testing, but we intentionally pick these locations because they're fairly consistent. There's not a lot of change, and we lay our plots out so that there's consistency in the trial, right? So that the soil isn't influencing our results. Well, if we can show this kind of yield advantage in a consistent, even plot, how much more do you think that yield advantage could be when you're going across the field that might have a little bit of a roll to it or might have changes in soil types where it's going to take different amounts of pressure to put that unit down and keep that unit consistent and getting that consistent depth. Here's an interesting thing is, so that what I just showed you were the results of all our locations averaged together. I'm going to look specifically at 2021 because we had some somewhat difficult planting conditions that year. And I want to break it down by location. So in Illinois, delta force provided a 1.7 bushel over a manual setting. Not really that big. In Indiana, bumped up to 4.1 bushels. So our Illinois PFR site, Central Illinois, it's what you think of when you think of Illinois soils. Flat, black, and beautiful, right? I think they could just broadcast spread corn and get 250 bushel, right? I sometimes wonder, those guys wouldn't know how to farm in Western Ohio. Our Indiana site, it's a clay loam, still highly productive, well drained. Our Ohio PFR site is heavy clay, and this particular year we no-tilled that corn. And at our Ohio PFR site, we saw almost 15 bushels gained with the delta force. So the heavier your soils, from what we've seen, the more of a benefit to hydraulic downforce. So these systems, while they are very effective and work very well, they're also not cheap. So how do you got to have enough gain over enough acres to pay for them. So this chart is your acres to pay off. So we'll focus on the dark green bar, that's 450 corn. So if we're looking at a 16-row planter, our data would tell you that if you're selling your corn for $450 in the fall, you would expect 1,441 acres is what you would need to plant to gain enough yield to pay for a delta force system in corn. So we also have a 12-row planter and a 24-row planter, so you can look at the numbers for your planter. It's really not that bad when the initial cost might shock you a little bit, but the payoff over time is pretty reasonable. And again, I think you would expect to probably see bigger gains on your farms than what we can see in our PFR sites. Flipping to soybeans, we are seeing an advantage of the delta force in soybeans as well. 1 to 2 bushels is what we're seeing in beans. So interesting to look at that. The payoff is about the same, about 1,500 acres, but the thing you got to remember is when this math is done for 30-inch rows. Most of us in Ohio are planting 15-inch beans. So if you're planting 15-inch beans, you would need to double that. So you're looking at about 3,000 acres to pay that off. So quite a bit more than what corn is, because you just have more rows to pay for, but still a reasonable thing to accomplish when you're looking at the benefits of that delta force. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through this section here. And we'll get to 2x2x2 starter fertilizer. So page 9. All right, so this group up here, I was able to listen in, and it was mentioned that this planter did not have, it's plumbed up for a fertilizer system, but isn't actually hooked up to the attachment, giving the option of where that fertilizer is placed. And so we're going to go through some of that. So first thing we'll start off with is looking at 2x2 fertilizer. So that's 2 inches over and 2 inches below the surface. That's how we define it for the purposes of this presentation. Versus 2x2x2, which is 2 inches over, 2 inches below the surface times 2, both sides of the row. So that's what we're looking at here. So for a long time, our PFR proven practice of started on the planter was 30 units of N, 2x2, and then follow up side dress 160 units of N, side dress of V3. That was the standard for a lot of years, couldn't beat it. We tried all different combinations of nitrogen timings, and that was the consistent winner. But then, when we started looking on both sides of the row, we saw that we gained 5.7 bushels by taking that same 30 pounds of N and splitting it and putting it on both sides. This is one of our most consistent PFR studies we found. Over the 4 years of testing at all the locations, 88% of the time, this was a winner. Not very often that we find something that consistent. 5.7 bushels when you average them all together. But when we thought, okay, if we're going on both sides of the row, we should be able to run twice the amount of fertilizer because we don't, it's spread out over twice as much area, so our salt content shouldn't be as much of a concern, right? I would normally not recommend running 60 pounds of N with the planter because it's too salty and can burn your seed, but if you're splitting it on both sides, you can do it and get away with it just fine. So is there a benefit to doing that? We found an additional 1.3 bushels if you doubled your rate with the planter, but then you reduced your side dress by 30 pounds also. So you can see it's the same total amount of N, we're just adding 30 more pounds with the planter. Now a lot of farmers look at that and say, well, for 1.3 bushels, I don't want to have to fill my planter twice as often. And I can understand that. We have a study that is starting to show some promising results that you might be able to get, if you put more on with the planter, you might be able to use less overall, but we're not going to get into that today. But we're basically finding very consistently splitting both sides of the row has worked very well. We've tested 3 different systems, Precision Planting, Conceal, Yetter, and the Martin Dual UMO, almost identical results from the 3 systems. So whatever system fits your planter better, that's the one to go with. I tend to like the Conceal. It works on just about every planter, and it's also the lightest of the 3. But from a yield result standpoint, they've all been pretty equal. But their Precision's not giving these away either. And so you'll find that they can tend to be kind of pricey. And when we're looking at $1,000 or more per row for the Conceal system, I've gotten the question, well, what if we just dribble it out the back? A lot less maintenance, a lot less weight, but what's our concern with dribbling out the back? Well, we got the concern of losing the fertilizer, but so how big is that loss when we can save a lot of money in the system that we use? That $140 a row is if you buy that nice manufactured tube mounting system. I've seen farmers, you don't have to be that great of a welder with some stainless steel tubes and a bracket. I've seen a lot of farmers make their own. I've been seeing farmers do it with hoses and zip ties. So pretty cheap way to put fertilizer on, but does it work? And what's the cost of dribbling on top versus running it down the row? So we put it to the test. This is the system that we used for testing that and laying it on the surface, and we wanted to see what is it hurting you. And 4 years of data, we found that it is about 3.4 bushels. So you're, that is what you're giving up, laying it on the surface versus putting it underground. We have seen that adding a stabilizer sometimes helps with that, but that isn't all that consistent. And so the better way to go is still going to be using a system like Conceal and placing it below the surface. And there's our acres to pay off for the Conceal system. 450 corn, 16-row planter, you're looking at about 525 acres to recapture that cost of that system. Now, we have some interesting data here showing that 30 pounds of UAN 28 or 2 gallons of thiazole has shown some yield advantage, 2x2x2. But anyone notice the little symbol up in the upper left-hand corner? That's on beans. So this was a few years ago. We started testing this on beans to just see. Oh, shoot! Sorry, lost my microphone. All right. A few years ago, we started testing this on beans, just to say, hey, does this even work on beans? Can we see an advantage? It was kind of a last minute thing. I think they messed up a study and had this empty plot, and they said, let's try it and see what happens. And it worked, and it worked 3 years in a row. So it's actually PFR proven to run 2x2x2 on beans. Why would that be? Beans produce their own nitrogen, right? So why would we see an advantage to adding some? Well, this is a nitrogen uptake curve for soybeans. You've probably seen this a whole bunch of times for corn, but it's not very often that you look at a nitrogen uptake chart for beans. But the interesting thing is, nodulation doesn't start until V2, which would be right about there. And you can see that some of that nitrogen has been taken up at that point. The bean plant needs about 20 pounds of N to get it to V2 before the nodules start producing nitrogen. And so think about your beans when you plant them, they come up out of the ground, they look good, but then they just kind of sit there for a while, right? And they might be like a pale green or almost a yellow color, and they kind of sit there for a while, and you think, what's going on? They're being lazy or they're going backwards, and then all of a sudden they take off and grow, right? During that time, that ugly yellow phase that the beans go through, that's when those nodules are forming. If we can give them a little bit of a boost to give them some nitrogen to start, they don't have to go find it with this little root system that they have. That can help them out. Now the concern is, well, will it make them lazy, and will it reduce the total nodules that we have? So in 2023, 2 years ago, our PFR team went out and they dug plants, and they looked at how many of these plants are actively fixing nodules, and they saw at 3 of our sites not a whole lot of difference between the control and between where we put 30 units of N 2x2x2. So just that 30 units is not decreasing or slowing down our nodulation. Here's an interesting thing though, we saw big differences between sites. So our Ohio PFR site, we were seeing really good, $30 an acre for UAN, $26 an acre for thiazole, $62 an acre for KTS, which is potassium sulfate. Minnesota, it didn't work up there. Other than being colder in Minnesota, what's the difference? Organic matter. Our Ohio PFR site, 1 to 2% organic matter. Minnesota, it might be cold, but they got good soil up there. Prairie soils, really nice loams, 4 to 5% organic matter. At higher organic matter, it's a whole lot easier for the beans to find the nitrogen on their own than what it is at lower organic matter soils. And I know in this area, a lot of you have a lot of lower organic matter soils very similar to what our PFR site has. All right. Here's the thing though, on a bean planter, especially if you're planting 15-inch beans, do you want to spend $1,000 a row to install a conceal system on a bean planter for double the number of rows? That's a harder thing to look at. So we're looking at the conceal versus the dribble, and we're looking at one side versus both sides of the row. And so here's 2 years of data across multiple locations, and we're seeing that the 2x2x2 below the surface is getting us the highest gain, but it's interesting that between it and just dribbling on one side of the row, not that big of a yield difference here. And so that's interesting to see that even though, yes, this is most profitable, when you look at the cost of the cost of the system, you know, you're going to pay for a single dribble system a lot faster than what you will a 2x2x2, even with half the profit here. But that's the multi-location data. Remember, I said there was a lot bigger advantage in just Ohio. Here's the Ohio data, and it's interesting that the single dribble, actually, the 2 years we've tested it, has actually been the best. Now, I will say that the single dribble system, both years that we did it, we got a rain within 3 days of planting. So that helps take that fertilizer down. If we'd have planted and it lay dry for 3 weeks, I'd expect to see different results. But at least the first 2 years we've tried it, we're seeing just dribbling on the surface has worked pretty well for the beans. And you know, you still have to have the tanks and pumps and hoses and everything, but that's a fairly inexpensive system to install on a planter. So something to think about there. All right, last topic I've got, and then we'll get you on to lunch. I'm already a few minutes over. I apologize for that. 2x2x2 versus in-furrow. This is a common question I get. Guys will say, I'm thinking about getting a new planter or a new to me planter, and it's set up for one type of fertilizer. What attachments should I put on it? What type of fertilizer? And so we've put these two systems head to head. So our control is no starter. Here we looked at 5 gallons of 624-6 in furrow, gained us 3.3 bushels, but that comes at a fairly high cost, and so we're actually losing money here. 2x2x2 has a significant advantage. Your fertilizer usually costs less because it's a more basic product of UAN compared to a highly refined product like that 624-6. And so what I'll say here is that I don't want to discount the value of in-furrow fertilizer, especially if you plant into cooler, wetter conditions. That's where in-furrow fertilizer really shines. But 2x2x2 is going to be more consistent year in and year out. Here's an interesting thing though. I broke down just the Ohio data last year, 2023. Anyone have any wet corn the fall of 23? At least where I'm from, we had really wet corn fall of 23. We had wet corn at the PFR site the fall of 23 also. Here's the interesting thing. Look at what your moisture does. Any fertilizer that you added with the planter had a significant difference, almost 2 points drier in the fall. Really interesting, and there's some university data that backs that up as well. Starter fertilizer at planting can influence your final harvest moisture in the fall. So just another reason to be putting that starter out there. Last comment is, I do get the question sometimes from guys, it's like, I just want to throw seed in the planter and go. I don't want to worry about fertilizer, I just want to cover acres. But I have to go across the field with my sprayer anyway. Can I just put my starter on with the sprayer? You can, but there is a cost to it, about $10 an acre less. It's interesting, last year when I showed the 2-year data, 2 years ago when we did this, the first year we did this, it was actually 13 bushels less. Then the last 2 years, the way that the weather has worked out, that gap has narrowed. But there is a advantage to the planter, and I think your fertilizer with the planter is going to be a lot more consistent. And so I'd be a big advocate for that 2x2x2 with the planter. It's all going right there by the row where the roots are going to be able to utilize it and keep you the most efficient and get that off to a good start. All right, questions or comments on anything I covered? All right, everyone's just ready for lunch, so you can smell it there at the back of the room. Okay, before I turn you loose, if you would like, so you've got the planter resource guide in front of you. If there's not enough for someone, let me know. I've got more in the truck. I'll grab one. I don't have enough PFR books here for everyone. If you would like a PFR book, snap a picture of that slide or jot down my phone number, and you can send me a text with your name and address, your mailing address, and I will send one to you in the mail. So you are welcome to that if you would like. And then last thing I'll give a quick shout out for is I make videos throughout the growing season on agronomic topics, what we're seeing. Tar spot shows up, or corn's turning yellow and we're not sure what's going on. If you would like, you're welcome to sign up for that. So you just text my last name, Hannewald, to that number 733-337, and then it'll opt you in, and 2 to 3 times a month during the growing season, I'll send out a video about what we're seeing, what to look for, and what to do about it to help you make decisions. We don't do Beck's advertising through this. We're not going to spam your phone or anything. I control this, and I only send timely agronomic updates. So you're welcome to sign up for it if you would like. If you don't want to, that's fine too. You've already listened to me for 40 minutes here, and you might say that's enough. So up to you. But I do really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks to Grant for inviting me. And I'll stick around through lunch. If anyone has any questions one-on-one, I'm happy to answer them. So.